The billionaire's daughter hated getting dirty until the old maid made her bake pancakes. The silence inside the Sterling mansion was not peaceful, it was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, heavy with unsaid words and strictly enforced rules. The marble floors of the foyer were polished to such a high gloss that they reflected the crystal chandelier above like a frozen lake. There was no dust. There was no clutter. And most disturbingly for a home with a 4-year-old child, there were no toys. Ethan Sterling, 35 years old and possessing a jawline that could cut glass, adjusted his silk tie in the hallway mirror. He was a man built of sharp angles and even sharper expectations. Since the accident 3 years ago, the day the laughter died in this house, he had constructed a fortress of perfection. Dirt was chaos. Chaos was dangerous. Therefore, everything had to be spotless. "I will be back at 6 sharp, Ethan said, his voice deep and devoid of warmth. He didn't look at the young woman standing nervously by the stairs. Sarah, 25 and startlingly beautiful in her navy blue uniform, nodded respectfully. She had only been working here for a week, but the oppression of the house was already seeping into her bones. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. Dinner will be ready. And Sarah." Ethan paused, his hand on the brass doorknob. He turned, his steel-grey eyes narrowing slightly. "Make sure Lily stays in the playroom. I found a smudge on the glass of the patio doors yesterday. I don't want her wandering around making a mess." "She's just a child, sir," Sarah said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Ethan's gaze hardened. "She is a Sterling. We do not do mess. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." The door clicked shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the vast, empty house. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked up toward the landing, where a small figure was hiding behind the banister. Lily Sterling was a doll of a child, with blonde curls and big, sorrowful eyes that looked too old for her face. She was wearing a pristine white dress that looked uncomfortable, her hands clasped tightly behind her back as if she were afraid to touch anything. She was terrified of getting dirty. Sarah had seen it the day before. When a drop of water had fallen on Lily's sleeve, the girl had started hyperventilating, terrified her father would see. It broke Sarah's heart. "He's gone, sweetie," Sarah called out softly, her voice warm and inviting. "You can come down." Lily descended the stairs slowly, step by step, ensuring she didn't scuff the wood. "Is Papa angry?" she whispered. "No, darling, Papa is just busy," Sarah lied, crouching down to be at eye level with the girl. Sarah's heart ached. She needed this job. Her family back home depended on the money she sent, but she couldn't stand seeing a child live like a museum exhibit. Sarah looked at Lily's clean hands, her clean dress, her clean, empty life. A rebellious spark ignited in Sarah's chest. It was a dangerous thought, one that could get her fired instantly, but looking at Lily's dull eyes, Sarah decided it was worth the risk. "Lily," Sarah whispered conspiratorially, "do you know what day it is?" Lily shook her head. "It's Pancake Day." "We have pancakes on Sunday. The chef makes them," Lily recited robotically. "No, not those pancakes," Sarah smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I mean real pancakes, the kind we make ourselves, with our hands." Lily's eyes widened in horror. "We can't. Papa says the kitchen is for the staff. We might spill." "Let's make a deal," Sarah said, standing up and offering her hand. "If we spill, I promise to clean it up before your papa gets home. He will never know. Just you and me. Trust me." Lily hesitated. She looked at the front door, then at Sarah's warm, open hand. For the first time in years, curiosity won over fear. She took Sarah's hand. 10 minutes later, the modern, clinical kitchen of the Sterling mansion was witnessing a revolution. Sarah had bypassed the stand mixer and the fancy gadgets. She had pulled out a large metal bowl, a whisk, and a massive bag of flour. "Okay," Sarah said, lifting Lily onto the marble island. First rule of Pancake Day. You have to destroy the enemy. The enemy? Lily asked, confused. The flour bag, Sarah declared. She grabbed the paper sack and instead of cutting it neatly, she popped the top open with a loud thwack. A puff of white dust floated into the air. Lily gasped, flinching back. You made a mess. It's not a mess, Sarah laughed, catching a bit of flour on her finger and booping Lily's nose. It's magic dust. Lily went cross-eyed, looking at the white spot on her nose. She reached up, touched it, and looked at the white powder on her finger. She didn't cry, she didn't shake. She looked at Sarah, who was smiling with such radiance that it felt like the sun had finally broken through the mansion's heavy curtains. Now the eggs, Sarah instructed. Smash it against the side, hard. Lily tapped the egg gently. Nothing happened. Harder, like you're a karate master, Sarah encouraged, striking a pose. Lily giggled, a rusty, quiet sound. She hit the egg harder. It shattered, yolk running over her fingers and onto the counter. Lily froze, her conditioning kicking in. Oh no, I'm sorry. For what? Sarah grabbed a handful of flour and threw it onto the spilled yolk, turning it into a doughy paste. Now it's just texture. Keep going. Over the next hour, the kitchen transformed. The pristine black marble island was covered in a layer of white snow. Eggshells were scattered like fallen soldiers. Milk had dripped down the side of the bowl. Sarah, usually so composed, had flour in her hair and a streak of batter across her cheek. But the biggest change was in Lily. The terrified porcelain doll was gone. In her place was a child. She was whisking the batter with both hands, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Her white dress was stained with yellow spots and white dust, but she didn't care. Watch this! Sarah grabbed a handful of flour and blew it toward Lily. The girl squealed, squeezing her eyes shut as the white cloud enveloped her. My turn! Lily grabbed a handful, her small fingers clumsy, and threw it at Sarah. It landed squarely on Sarah's chest, puffing up into her face. They both froze for a second and then the dam broke. Lily laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle, it was a deep, belly-shaking laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Sarah laughed with her, grabbing the whisk and using it as a microphone, singing a pop song while flipping the first pancake on the griddle. The smell of melting butter and sweet vanilla filled the sterile air, chasing away the coldness. Higher! Flip it higher! Lily screamed, clapping her flour-covered hands. Are you ready? Sarah challenged, holding the pan. 1, 2, 3! She flipped the pancake high into the air. Lily shrieked with delight, tilting her head back, watching the golden disc spin. At that exact moment, the heavy oak double doors of the kitchen swung open. The laughter cut off instantly. The pancake landed with a wet plat on the floor, missing the pan entirely. Ethan Sterling stood in the doorway. He had come home early to retrieve a forgotten file. He was still in his impeccably tailored suit, his briefcase in hand, his presence looming like a thundercloud. He looked at the floor, where the pancake lay. He looked at the counter, decimated by flour and shells. He looked at Sarah, whose hair was a mess of white dust, and then his eyes landed on his daughter. Lily, covered from head to toe in filth, her face smeared with batter, standing in the middle of the chaos he hated so much. The silence that returned to the room was more terrifying than anything Sarah had ever felt. She stepped in front of Lily instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had broken the one rule. She had destroyed the sanctuary. Mr. Sterling, Sarah began, her voice trembling but determined. This is entirely my fault. I forced her. Don't blame her. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared at the flour on his daughter's nose, his face unreadable, a statue of cold fury about to shatter. The kitchen was so quiet that the sizzling of the butter on the forgotten griddle sounded like fireworks. Sarah stood as a human shield between the billionaire and his daughter, her hands clenching the sides of her apron. She waited for the explosion. She waited for the yelling, the immediate firing, the cold anger that usually radiated from Ethan Sterling. Lily peeked out from behind Sarah's legs, her earlier joy evaporating into pure terror. She trembled, her small, flower-covered hands gripping Sarah's skirt. "Papa, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hitching. "I'll clean it. I promise." That small, terrified voice seemed to snap something inside Ethan. His briefcase slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. He didn't seem to notice. His eyes were locked on Lily, but he wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking at her face. Specifically, he was looking at the streak of flour on her cheek and the way her eyes were bright and alive, even in fear. He took a step forward. Sarah braced herself, ready to beg for the child's forgiveness, ready to take all the blame. "Sir, please," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I can pack my bags. Just don't be mad at her. She was just being a child." Ethan ignored her. He walked straight past Sarah, moving with a strange, jagged gait, as if his legs were failing him. He reached the island where Lily stood. He looked at the disaster, the spilt milk, the eggshells, the white dust covering his expensive Italian marble. And then the unthinkable happened. The man who fired employees for a wrinkled shirt, the man who hadn't shown an ounce of emotion in 3 years, dropped to his knees. He didn't care that his trousers, worth more than Sarah's yearly salary, hit the flour-covered floor. He didn't care that the sticky batter residue soaked into the fabric. He fell to his knees so he was eye-level with Lily. His breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. His eyes were wide, red-rimmed and glistening. "Papa?" Lily asked, confused by this change in perspective. She had never seen her father this low, physically or emotionally. Ethan reached out a hand. His fingers were trembling violently. He hesitated, as if afraid to touch her, as if she were a mirage that would vanish. Slowly, gently, he reached out and brushed the flour off her cheek with his thumb. The sensation of the powder, the smell of the vanilla and butter. It hit him like a physical blow. Flashback. It wasn't just a smell, it was a time machine. Suddenly, he wasn't in the cold grey kitchen of 2025. He was back 3 years ago. Sunday morning. The sunlight was hitting this same island. His wife, Elena, was laughing, trying to catch Lily, then just a baby, who was crawling through a pile of spilled sugar. Elena had flour in her hair, just like Sarah did now. She had looked at him, her blue eyes sparkling, and said, "Ethan, come here. You're too clean. Hug us." He had laughed then. He had hugged them both, not caring about his clothes. That was the last Sunday before the car crash, before the world went grey. Before he decided that if he kept everything perfect, if he kept everything in its place, he wouldn't have to feel the chaotic, messy pain of loss. End flashback. The memory tore through him, ripping open the wound he had spent years stitching up with rules and silence. "You," Ethan choked out, his voice cracking, "you smell like her." A single tear escaped his eye, tracking through the stubble on his cheek, then another, then a flood. Ethan Sterling, the Ice King, buried his face in his hands and began to sob. It wasn't a polite cry. It was a guttural, raw sound of grief that had been dammed up for far too long. He wept for the lost years, for the silence he had forced upon his daughter, for the wife he couldn't save. Sarah stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. This was not the reaction she had prepared for. She had expected rage. She got devastation. She looked down at the man crumbling before her. The power dynamic shifted instantly. He wasn't the billionaire boss anymore. He was a broken man. Lily, seeing her father cry, did the only thing instinct told her to do. She stepped forward. She didn't care about the rules anymore. She wrapped her small, sticky arms around his neck and pressed her flour-dusted face against his expensive suit jacket. "Don't cry, Papa," she soothed, patting his back with a rhythm she must have learned from a dream. "It's just flour. Sarah says it's magic dust." Ethan gasped, wrapping his powerful arms around his tiny daughter, pulling her into his chest as if she were a life raft in a stormy ocean. He buried his face in her small shoulder, not caring that he was ruining his suit, not caring that the staff might see. He held her tight, rocking back and forth. "I missed you," he whispered into her hair, his voice barely audible. "I missed you so much, Lily." He wasn't talking about her being gone. She had been there physically the whole time. He was talking about her spirit, the spirit he had crushed with his grief. Sarah felt like an intruder in this intimate moment, yet she couldn't look away. Tears pricked her own eyes. She quietly turned off the stove to prevent the butter from burning. She reached for a towel to clean her hands, thinking she should slip away and leave them alone. But as she moved, Ethan looked up. His eyes were red, his face wet with tears, but the steel wall was gone. He looked at Sarah with an intensity that made her breath hitch. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, bewildered gratitude. He didn't stand up. He stayed on his knees, holding Lily with one arm, and looked at the young maid who had dared to disobey him. "You did this," he said hoarsely. Sarah flinched slightly. I thought she needed to smile, sir." Ethan looked around the kitchen. He saw the disaster. For the first time, he didn't see a mess to be cleaned. He saw life. He saw the evidence of happiness. "I was going to fire anyone who made a mess in this kitchen," Ethan admitted, his voice regaining some stability but remaining soft. Sarah looked down, resigned. "I understand, Mr. Sterling. I'll go pack my—" "No," he interrupted sharply. He gently released Lily but kept his hand on her shoulder. He stood up slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand, smearing a bit of flour onto his own cheek in the process. He looked at the mess on his suit and let out a short, incredulous exhale that sounded almost like a laugh. "No," he repeated, looking Sarah directly in the eyes. "You're not going anywhere. You brought my daughter back to me." He walked over to the counter, picked up the spatula Sarah had dropped, and looked at the burnt butter in the pan. He looked at the bowl of half-mixed batter. "Sarah," he said, using her name with a softness she hadn't heard before, "this pancake is ruined. I can make another batch, sir. I'll clean up first and—" "No," Ethan said again. He took off his jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a pristine dining chair. He rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, revealing strong forearms. He walked over to the flour bag. "Show me," Ethan commanded, but it wasn't an order, it was a plea. "Show me how to make them. Show me how to make the magic dust." Lily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Papa is going to cook?" Ethan looked down at his daughter, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "Papa is going to try, but I think I need to get dirty first." He reached into the flour bag, grabbed a small handful, and hesitatingly, awkwardly, rubbed it onto his own immaculate shirt. He looked at Sarah, his eyes searching hers for approval, for guidance, for absolution. "Well," Ethan asked, his voice thick with emotion, "what do we do next, Chef Sarah?" Sarah smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up the room. She picked up the whisk and handed it to the billionaire. "First," she said softly, "we make a mess." The kitchen, once a sterile laboratory of culinary perfection, now looked like a bomb had gone off inside a bakery. Flour coated the floor in snowy drifts. Eggshells crunched underfoot. But the air was different. It smelled of burnt sugar, vanilla extract, and something warmer, something that smelled like home. Ethan Sterling, a man whose signature alone could move markets across 3 continents, was currently frowning at a frying pan with the same intensity he usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. He held the spatula like a foreign object. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms dusted with white powder, and there was a smear of egg yolk on his chin that he was completely unaware of. "It's burning again," Lily pointed out helpfully from her perch on the counter. She was swinging her legs, her face glowing with a happiness that made Ethan's chest ache. "It is not burning," Ethan muttered, flipping the pancake. It landed with a heavy thud, charred black on one side. "It is caramelizing." Sarah couldn't help it. She let out a laugh, a melodious, bright sound that seemed to bounce off the marble walls. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, that pancake is coal. If you eat that, you'll be crunching for a week." Ethan looked at the burnt disc, then at Sarah. For a second, the old Ethan flickered behind his eyes, the man who demanded perfection. But then he looked at Lily, who was giggling behind her hand. The tension dissolved. He let out a sigh of defeat, his shoulders slumping. "I'm terrible at this," he admitted, his voice low. "Elena, she was the cook. I was just the one who did the dishes." The mention of her name didn't suck the air out of the room this time. Instead, it hung there, gentle and sad. "She would have loved this mess," Sarah said softly, moving next to him. She didn't take the spatula from him. Instead, she placed her hand gently over his, guiding his wrist. Her skin was warm against his, and a jolt of electricity seemed to arc between them, subtle but undeniable. "It's all in the wrist. Don't force it. Let it slide." Ethan froze at the contact. It had been 3 years since he had felt a woman's touch that wasn't a handshake or a polite tap on the shoulder. He looked down at her hand, covering his. Her fingers were slender but strong, roughened slightly by work. He breathed in the scent of her, soap and vanilla. "Like this," he whispered, his voice rougher than he intended. "Like that," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She guided his hand, and together they poured a fresh circle of batter. It sizzled perfectly, turning a golden brown. They stood there for a beat too long, trapped in the small, intimate bubble of the cooking station. Lily's voice broke the spell. "I'm hungry." Ethan cleared his throat and stepped back, creating a respectable distance between himself and the maid. "Right. Breakfast." They didn't eat at the grand dining table, which could seat 20 people. It felt too far away, too cold. Instead, without discussing it, they sat on the floor of the kitchen, leaning against the cabinets. A plate of slightly misshapen but edible pancakes sat between them. Ethan took a bite. It was doughy in the middle and crispy on the edges, nothing like the Michelin star quality meals his private chef prepared. "It's the best thing I've tasted in 3 years, Ethan said, and he meant it. He looked at Lily, who was shoving a syrup-drenched piece into her mouth with her hands. "Why did you stop?" Sarah asked. She wasn't looking at him. She was tracing a pattern in the flour on the floor with her finger. "Why did you ban the toys, the noise?" Ethan put his fork down. The silence returned, but it wasn't threatening anymore. It was reflective. "Because I was afraid," he confessed, looking at his daughter. "After the accident, and the silence was the only thing I could control. Noise meant life, and life is fragile. Life can be taken away in a second. I thought if I kept everything perfectly still, perfectly clean, nothing bad could ever happen to her again. I thought if I froze time, I wouldn't have to feel the pain of moving forward without Elena." He turned to Sarah, his grey eyes searching hers. "I thought I was protecting her, but I was just building a prison." Sarah reached out and placed her hand on his arm. It was a bold move for an employee, but the lines had been blurred so thoroughly that morning that titles seemed irrelevant. "You were grieving, Ethan," she said, using his first name for the first time. "But Lily isn't a porcelain doll. She's a little girl. She needs to scrape her knees. She needs to get dirty. She needs to know that even if she makes a mess, she's still loved. That's what childhood is. It's a beautiful, chaotic mess." Ethan looked at the flour on his trousers, then at the syrup on his daughter's face. He realized the sterility of the house hadn't protected them from pain. It had only insulated them from joy. "I don't know how to do that," Ethan admitted, his voice vulnerable. "I don't know how to be the fun dad. I've forgotten how to play." Lily crawled over to him, leaving sticky handprints on his shirt. She climbed into his lap, resting her head on his chest. "I can teach you, Papa," she murmured sleepily, the sugar crash setting in. "Sarah can teach you too." Ethan wrapped his arms around his daughter, resting his chin on her head. He looked at Sarah over Lily's messy curls. There was a challenge in his eyes, but also a plea. "Will you?" he asked. "Will you help us fix this? Not the house. Us." Sarah smiled, and it was the kind of smile that promised a new dawn. "I think that's in my job description now, sir." "Ethan," he corrected. "When we're like this, just Ethan." "Okay," Sarah whispered, a blush rising to her cheeks. "Ethan." 2 weeks later, the Sterling mansion was undergoing a transformation that baffled the rest of the staff. The changes were subtle at first. A stray teddy bear left on the grand staircase, a pair of muddy miniature rain boots by the front door, the sound of cartoon music drifting from the living room, which had previously been treated with the reverence of a cathedral. Ethan Sterling was changing too. He was leaving the office at 4 o'clock. His suits were still sharp, but his tie was often loosened before he even walked through the door. The shadows under his eyes were fading, replaced by a light that his board of directors couldn't quite place. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside was a bruised purple, pouring rain in sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conservatory. Ethan walked into the house, shaking his umbrella. He expected to find Lily in the playroom or the kitchen. Instead, he followed the sound of shrieks and laughter to the back garden doors. He stopped in the doorway, his briefcase hanging from his hand. Outside, in the pouring rain, Sarah and Lily were jumping in puddles. They weren't wearing raincoats, they were soaked to the bone. Sarah's hair was plastered to her face, her uniform clinging to her skin. Lily was stomping in a mud puddle, splashing brown water all over Sarah, who was laughing so hard she was doubled over. "Take that, you mud monster!" Lily yelled, kicking a wave of water toward Sarah. "Oh, you want a war?" Sarah gasped, wiping mud from her cheek. "I'll give you a war." She jumped with both feet, sending a tsunami of muddy water over the squealing child. Ethan watched them, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of it. The old Ethan would have been horrified. Pneumonia, ruined clothes, mud tracked into the house. The list of infractions was endless, but the new Ethan, the one who had tasted burnt pancakes and felt the warmth of a hug, just felt a strange tug in his chest. It was jealousy, not of them, but for them. He wanted to be part of that electric, messy joy. Sarah looked up and saw him standing there, framed by the dry safety of the house. She froze, her smile faltering slightly. Old habits died hard, and the sight of the master of the house watching them roll in mud was still alarming. "Mr. Ethan," she called out, breathless, pushing wet hair out of her eyes. I know, it's raining." But she really wanted to see if frogs like rain, and one thing led to another, and she stopped rambling when she saw him unbuttoning his jacket. Ethan tossed his suit jacket onto the dry floor inside. Then he kicked off his shoes. He peeled off his socks, leaving them in a neat pile. He rolled up his trousers. "Papa," Lily asked, stopping her splashing. She looked at him with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. "What are you doing?" Ethan didn't answer. He stepped out into the rain. The cold water hit him instantly, soaking his white shirt, making it translucent against his skin. The mud oozed between his toes, a sensation so alien, so grounding, that it made him shiver. He walked slowly toward them. The rain hammered down, washing away the corporate titan, leaving just a man. He stopped in front of Sarah. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Shock, admiration, and something hotter, something deeply feminine. The rain ran down his face, dripping from his nose. "You missed a spot," Ethan said seriously, pointing to Sarah's clean left shoulder. "I did?" Sarah breathed, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Yes." Ethan crouched down, scooped up a handful of mud, and with a grin that took 10 years off his face, smeared it gently onto her shoulder. "Papa is a mud monster too," Lily screamed in delight, tackling his legs. Ethan lost his balance and fell backward into the wet grass, pulling Lily with him. Sarah laughed, a sound of pure relief and affection, and dropped to her knees beside them. For the next 20 minutes, they were a tangle of limbs and laughter. They built a mud castle that immediately collapsed. They had a race to the oak tree, slipping and sliding on the wet grass. Ethan Sterling, whose time was billed at thousands of dollars an hour, was currently lying on his back in the mud, letting the rain wash over his face, feeling more alive than he had in years. Eventually, the cold began to set in. "All right, truce," Ethan gasped, sitting up and wiping mud from his eyes. "Truce before we all freeze." He looked at Sarah. She was shivering slightly, her arms wrapped around herself. Her wet clothes clung to her curves, and for a moment Ethan forgot about the cold. He saw the woman who had saved his family. He saw her kindness, her fire, her beauty. He stood up and offered a hand to pull her up. When she took it, he didn't let go immediately. He pulled her close, ostensibly to steady her on the slippery grass. But they ended up standing, chest to chest. Lily had already run ahead to the porch, shaking like a wet puppy. "You're shivering," Ethan murmured, looking down at Sarah. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, creating a soft, rhythmic drumming around them. "I'm fine," Sarah stammered, looking up into his grey eyes. They were storm-coloured, intense, and focused entirely on her. You're full of mud, Ethan." "I don't care," he said, and his voice dropped an octave. He reached up, his hand hovering for a second before he brushed a wet strand of hair away from her face. His thumb lingered on her cheekbone. "Thank you for bringing the rain, for bringing the noise." Sarah's breath hitched. The air between them crackled with unsaid words. It was a dangerous line to cross, employer and employee, billionaire and maid, but the mud had leveled the playing field. Out here, they were just a man and a woman who had found a way to laugh again. "You needed it," she whispered. "You both did." Ethan leaned in closer. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. He was close enough to feel the heat radiating from her skin despite the rain. "I didn't know how much I needed you," he corrected. Sarah's heart slammed against her chest. She wanted to lean in. She wanted to bridge the final inch between them, but the reality of who they were crashed back in. She stepped back gently, breaking the contact. We should get Lily inside," she said, her voice trembling. "She'll catch a cold." Ethan stayed still for a moment, his hand still raised where her face had been. He nodded slowly, the mask of the billionaire sliding back into place, but it didn't fit as tightly as before. "Right," he said. "Let's go inside." They walked back to the house in silence, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. As they entered the warm, dry kitchen, dripping water onto the floor, Ethan didn't call for the cleaning crew. He grabbed a stack of towels. He wrapped one around Lily, rubbing her hair vigorously until she giggled. Then he handed one to Sarah. Their fingers brushed again, and the spark was still there, hotter than before. "Go change," Ethan said softly. "I'll make the hot chocolate." "And Sarah?" She turned at the door. "Yes?" "Don't worry about the mud on the floor," he said, looking at the dirty footprints trailing through his pristine home. He smiled, a genuine crooked smile. "It adds character." Sarah smiled back, her heart full. But as she walked up the stairs to change, a shadow of worry crossed her face. They were getting too close. She was falling for him, and he was beginning to look at her as more than just help. In fairy tales, this was the happy ending. But in the real world, billionaires didn't marry maids, and she knew that soon reality would come knocking on the door to test this fragile new happiness. She didn't know how right she was. The test was coming sooner than she thought. The final test of the Sterling Mansion's new foundation arrived 3 days later, not with a bang, but with the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels on marble. It was Saturday. The rain had cleared, leaving the world outside vibrant and green, but inside an even more colourful explosion was taking place. The grand living room, a space previously reserved for stiff cocktail parties and silent reading, had been transformed into an art studio. Sheets were draped over the expensive beige sofas. The floor was covered in butcher paper. Ethan, Sarah, and Lily were in the center of it all, armed with non-toxic finger paints. "Blue!" Lily commanded, holding up a hand that was already coated in red. "I need blue for the sky." "Coming right up, boss," Ethan laughed. He was wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, clothing he hadn't worn since college. He looked younger, lighter. He squeezed a blob of blue paint onto the paper plate palette. "Sarah, you're slacking on the clouds." Sarah, kneeling on the floor with a smudge of yellow on her nose, rolled her eyes playfully. "Art takes time, Ethan. You can't rush a masterpiece." She looked at him, and her heart did that familiar flip-flop. The last few days had been a blur of domestic bliss that felt too good to be true. They hadn't crossed the physical line since the moment in the rain, but the emotional line had been obliterated. They shared looks across the dinner table. They brushed hands in the hallway. They were a family in everything but name. "I think the sky needs a sun," Lily declared, reaching for the yellow paint. She spun around, her hand flying out, and froze. Ethan followed her gaze. His smile died instantly. Standing in the archway of the living room, looking like a statue carved from ice and disapproval, was Victoria Sterling, Ethan's mother, the matriarch of the family and the architect of the rigid expectations that had nearly suffocated him. She was dressed in a severe Chanel suit, her silver hair coiffed to perfection, her pearls gleaming in the afternoon light. Her eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the room. They took in the covered furniture, the paper on the floor, the paint on her son's face, and finally they landed on Sarah. The silence was deafening. It was the old silence, the heavy one, rushing back in to choke the life out of the room. "Mother," Ethan said, standing up slowly. He instinctively moved to shield Lily and Sarah, a protective stance that didn't go unnoticed by the older woman. "I wasn't expecting you." "Clearly," Victoria said. Her voice was low, smooth, and laced with venom. She walked into the room, stepping carefully around the edge of the butcher paper as if it were contaminated waste. "I came to see my granddaughter. I tried calling, but apparently no one answers phones in this house anymore." She stopped in front of Ethan, looking him up and down with disdain. "Look at you. You look like a gardener." "We're playing, Mother," Ethan said, his voice firm. "It's called finger painting." Victoria's lip curled. She turned her gaze to Sarah. Sarah scrambled to her feet, wiping her hands frantically on her apron, feeling small and dirty under the woman's glare. This was the reality check she had feared. This was the world telling her she didn't belong. "And this," Victoria said, gesturing to Sarah with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand, "must be the reason for this degradation. I hired you to clean, young woman, not to turn my son's home into a kindergarten circus." "Mrs. Sterling, Sarah began, her voice trembling. "Silence," Victoria snapped. "I don't speak to the help unless I'm giving an order." She turned back to Ethan. "Ethan, this is unacceptable. You are a Sterling. We do not roll around on the floor. We do not wear rags. And we certainly do not fraternize with the staff in such a disgraceful manner. You are dishonoring Elena's memory." The mention of Elena was a calculated low blow. Usually, it would have been enough to make Ethan retreat, to make him apologize and return to the cold safety of his grief. But Ethan looked at Lily. She was shrinking back, the joy gone from her face, replaced by the old fear. He looked at Sarah. She was holding back tears, looking ready to run, ready to disappear to save him the embarrassment. And something inside Ethan Sterling finally snapped. Not a breakdown, but a breakthrough. "Don't," Ethan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a sledgehammer. Victoria blinked, surprised. "Excuse me. Don't you dare use Elena's name to enforce your misery," Ethan said, stepping forward. He didn't care about the paint on his clothes. He stood tall, radiating a power that had nothing to do with money. Elena loved life. She loved mess. She loved laughter. You didn't approve of her either, remember? You told me she was too loud, too undisciplined. Victoria stiffened. I only wanted what was best for you. No, Ethan shook his head. You wanted perfection. And perfection is cold. Perfection is dead. I spent 3 years living in the mausoleum you wanted me to build. I almost lost my daughter to it. He reached out and grabbed Sarah's hand. He didn't hide it. He interlaced his paint-stained fingers with hers, pulling her to his side. Sarah gasped softly, looking up at him in shock. This woman, Ethan said, lifting Sarah's hand, brought my daughter back to life. She brought me back to life. She taught us that a little dirt doesn't matter. She taught us that love is messy. If that makes this house a circus, then I'll buy the damn tent. Victoria stared at their joined hands with horror. Ethan, think about what you're doing. She's a maid. She's a nobody. You are ruining your reputation. If you choose this lifestyle, I will wash my hands of you. It was the ultimate threat, the withdrawal of the matriarch's approval, the social exile. Ethan looked at his mother, really looked at her, and realized how small she seemed, how lonely. That is your choice, Mother, Ethan said calmly. But Sarah stays. The paint stays. The laughter stays. If you can't handle that, then you know where the door is. The room held its breath. Lily watched with wide eyes. Sarah squeezed Ethan's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. Victoria stood there for a long moment, her face a mask of fury fighting with shock. She had lost. She smoothed her jacket, lifted her chin, and turned on her heel. You are making a mistake, she hissed. No, Ethan replied. For the first time in years, I'm doing something right. Victoria marched out. The click of her heels faded down the hallway, followed by the heavy thud of the front door closing. The silence that followed this time was different. It was the silence of a storm that had passed, leaving the air clear and electrified. Ethan didn't let go of Sarah's hand. He turned to her. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. Sarah started, her voice shaking. You didn't have to do that. She's your mother. She was wrong, Ethan said. He lifted his other hand to cup Sarah's face, ignoring the fact that he was smearing a bit of blue paint on her cheek. She said you were a nobody. But you're everything, Sarah. You're everything to Lily, and... He paused, his grey eyes searching hers. You're everything to me. Sarah's breath hitched. Ethan. I know, he rushed on, needing to say it, needing to break the last barrier. I know I'm your boss. I know this is complicated. I know I come with baggage and grief and a crazy mother. But I can't go back to the way it was before you. I don't want a clean house. I want a full life. I want you in it, not as an employee, as a partner. Tears spilled from Sarah's eyes, cutting tracks through the yellow smudge on her nose. She had fallen in love with the broken man who learned to make pancakes. She had fallen in love with the father who played in the mud. I don't care about the money, Ethan, she whispered. I don't care about the mansion. I know, Ethan smiled, a soft, genuine smile. You just care about the pancakes. And the people who make them, she corrected. Ethan leaned down. This time there was no hesitation, no rain to distract them, no guilt. He kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of promise, of paint fumes, and of a future that was beautifully, perfectly messy. Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, melting into him. It was the sealing of a pact, a promise that the cold days were over. You! The voice broke them apart. They looked down. Lily was standing there, hands on her hips, a look of mock disgust on her face. Kissing is gross, she proclaimed. We have to finish the sun. Ethan and Sarah burst out laughing, forehead to forehead. You heard the boss, Ethan murmured against Sarah's lips. Back to work. Epilogue. 6 months later. The kitchen of the Sterling mansion was unrecognizable. The sleek, empty counters were now cluttered with jars of cookies, children's drawings held up by magnets on the massive fridge, and a vase of wildflowers picked from the garden. It was Sunday morning. Ethan stood at the stove. He was wearing an apron that said "Grill Master," which was slightly too small for him. He was flipping pancakes with the confidence of a professional, though one or two were still slightly charred. Sarah sat at the island, drinking coffee, reading the newspaper. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She was wearing a soft cashmere sweater and jeans, a diamond ring sparkling simply on her finger. Lily, now 5, was sitting on the counter, something that would have caused a heart attack in the past, mixing chocolate chips into a bowl of batter. "Papa, watch!" Lily yelled. "I'm going to do the triple flip." "Careful, Lil," Sarah warned, though she was smiling. Lily threw a handful of chocolate chips into the air. They rained down, missing the bowl entirely, scattering all over the clean floor. Ethan turned around. He looked at the chocolate on the floor. He looked at the flour dusting the air. He looked at his 2 girls. "Oh no," Ethan said, feigning horror. "A mess." "What are we going to do?" Lily giggled. Ethan walked over, scooped Lily up in one arm and grabbed Sarah's hand with the other. "We leave it," Ethan declared, kissing Sarah on the temple. "We eat the pancakes first. We clean later." "Or," Sarah suggested, a mischievous glint in her eye, "we get the dog to clean it up." "We don't have a dog," Ethan said. "Not yet," Sarah grinned. "But I saw a puppy that loves mud just as much as you do." Ethan groaned, but his smile was wide and bright. A puppy. A messy puppy. Perfect. As the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes and the flour in the air, the Sterling mansion was no longer a museum. It was a home. It was dirty. It was loud. It was chaotic. And it was absolutely perfect. The end.